And I think we're live. I'm here with Zachary Foster, who is a historian of Palestine. I remember reading your Ph.D. thesis and enjoying it a lot, actually. I'm going to let you do a bit of an intro of yourself, Zach, before we dive in.
Sure. First of all, Zahir, thanks so much for having me on. And just a bit about myself. I grew up in Metro Detroit in a Jewish community, going to Jewish schools and Jewish summer camps, Jewish youth groups. So very, very Jewish Zionist environment. Went to Israel with my Jewish youth group in high school. Got more interested in Israel Palestine in college. Did a semester abroad in Jerusalem, and that got me much more interested in the Arab world in Palestine, in Palestinian people more generally. Got to meet some Palestinians, and just one thing led to the next. And I started learning Arabic and did graduate studies in Arabic, in the Arab world, Arab history, and then did my PhD on the origins of a Palestinian identity in the late Ottoman period, as well as a history of the word, of the concept, of the idea of Palestine. And over the past couple of years, I've dedicated a lot of my work to trying to make academic research on Palestine more accessible to broader audiences. And so I write a lot on Twitter. I have a newsletter called Palestine in Your Inbox, and I've been doing a lot of pods and just generally trying to make what everyone describes as such a complex conflict, trying to just trying to make it more understandable and more trying to boil down this incredibly in theory complex conflict into a much more understandable conflict, so that people can understand how we got to October 7th, how we got to where we got to today.
Very well put. I guess the first thing to point out before we talk about anything is the context in which we're having this conversation. We are witnessing something that is still difficult for me to wrap my mind around. We are in the wake of effectively another Nakba. More Palestinians have died in this war, if you can call it a war, than did in the Nakba. More Palestinians have been displaced, and we face the same genocidal rhetoric and denial of Palestinian existence, the Palestinian narrative, and the Palestinian identity that we saw in the wake of the Zionist movement and the prior to 48 and the lead up and during the Nakba. And I guess that's why I think this conversation matters. I think the erasure of the Palestinian identity, or the reduction of the conflict into some kind of a dispute over borders, between these two states that just can't seem to agree on what settlements belong on which side of the wall, is very much how I often see the narrative portrayed. And then there's the Hasbara aspect, which constantly, since Golda Meir tries to deny the existence of Palestinian people, the existence of the Palestinian identity, both in the cultural sense as well as literally through the removal of Palestinian people, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their lands in 48, all the way through to today in 2023. So to start with, I want to talk about the name Palestine, the origins of the name, where it came from, and sort of a high-level chronology of how it evolved and how it was used throughout history.
Yeah, so the name Palestine dates to the ancient world. We have Hebrew sources, we have Assyrian sources, and we have Egyptian hieroglyphic sources that all refer to this place that later became known in English as Palestine. We don't know how it was pronounced in ancient Assyrian or in the ancient hieroglyphic sources. Those languages are dead, they're no longer spoken, so we don't know the pronunciation. But in the Hebrew Bible, at least, the term was known as pleshet. And in the Egyptian and Assyrian sources, it comes in the form of like peresete or pelest or pesht. So it comes in different variations in different languages. But what we believe, what we know about this term, is that it was used to describe the land that was occupied by the seafaring peoples, the Philistines. And so the word gets it goes from these ancient Near Eastern languages to ancient Greek. And the first Greek source that we know about that uses the term Palestine comes in the 5th century BCE, so 500 years before the birth of Christ. And then you find the word in many, many Greek sources over the course of the next 500-600 years. The word goes from ancient Greek to Latin. And from Latin, it goes into from Latin, it gets picked up by the Arab conquerors in the 7th century after CE. And then from Arabic, it gets into Persian and into Ottoman Turkish later, and then into all the modern Eastern and modern Western languages that we know and love today. That is kind of a very brief history of the term from its origins in the ancient Near East to the present.
Very well put. To bring you back to the Greco-Roman era of this history, one of the most commonly touted talking points or myths is this sort of Hadrian Eraa theory. And it's spoken of as though there is like historical certainty, that there is a consensus around this idea. Basically, the Hadrian Eraa theory goes something along the lines of following the revolt and the destruction of the Judean province in ancient Rome, Hadrian, as an act of vengeance, erases the name Judea from history and replaces it with Syria Palestina. And the relevance of this is that it is such a good microcosm of how Zionists and a lot of sort of Haspera talking points relates to the Palestinian identity in the first place, that effectively Palestine is a way to erase Jewish history. You know, it's a fictional, a made-up identity, like Golda Meir said, there's no such thing as Palestinian people in order to deny Jewish people their homeland. Yeah, I want you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I might make one correction to the way you narrated the story from the perspective of Zionist mythologists. So the way the story is often retold or recounted is that Hadrian replaced the name Judea with the name Palestina, as is. But in fact, as you correctly pointed out, that even that rendition of the story is false. The story, as Zionist mythologists like to tell it, is that after the Roman Empire put down the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135 CE, in order to erase the name Judea, the Roman Emperor Hadrian used the name the enemies of the Jewish people. He embraced this name, the Philistines, who were the enemies of the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible, and used that name, Palestina, not Palestinian Syria, Palestina itself, in place of Judea after the Judean kingdom was destroyed. Of course, even that rendition is false, as you correctly pointed out. Actually, the name that appears in inscriptions after 135 CE is Palestinian Syria, or Syria Palestina in Latin. And so that the first point to make here is that even the way it's often told, even the way the story is often recounted, is in and of itself fiction, is in and of itself false. It's that it was not Palestina, it was Palestinian Syria, already challenging this idea that it was like, Palestine, the enemies, the Philistines, the enemies of the Jewish people, that the name of the enemies that was used in place of Judea. But it's important to remember, though, that this narrative is based on very shaky evidence. Recall that the entire basis of the theory is, first of all, not based on any actual evidence that suggests that Hadrian changed the name. We don't even know that Hadrian changed the name at all. There's no documentary evidence, not in the form of any inscriptions or any chronicles or any other type of evidence that suggests Hadrian changed the name at all. Instead, the evidence we have is that after 135 CE, in addition to continue to see the name Judea on inscriptions after 135 CE, we, in addition to that, see inscriptions that now refer to this place as Syria Palestina. Okay, so that's what we know. We know that after 135 CE, we start to see the term Palestinian Syria on inscriptions to refer to this land. after the Bar Kokhba revolt is crushed by the Roman Empire. So even to make the argument that Hadrian changed the name, forgetting about the vengefulness of it, but even to make the claim that Hadrian, explicitly changed the name, that is already speculation. It could well be the case that after the Judean kingdom was destroyed, the people in the area started to call the place what it was known as already. And it was already known as Palestinian Syria. We have many, probably a dozen, if not 24 sources, Greek sources and Latin sources predating the Bar Kokhba revolt, but long before 132 CE, in which the name of this region is Palestine or Syria Palestine or Palestinian Syria, right? So it's quite possible that after the Judean kingdom was destroyed, the people of the area started to call the place what it was known as before the Judean kingdom took hold, in between 132 and 135. So it could well be the case that there was no explicit name change at all. In fact, that is quite possible. So that's one explanation. I think the other part of the theory that's problematic is this argument that Hadrian vengefully changed the name as a result of his hatred of Judea and of the Jews. That is, of course, also speculation. If you accept that the name change was intentional, that it was not a case of dynamic evolution, but it was the case of an actual explicit name
decree
change
from the Roman emperor, so to speak.
Exactly. If you accept that it was a decree rather than dynamic evolution, it could well be the case that Hadrian chose the name Palestinian Syria because, as we already said, that was what people were already calling it, but also because of his love for ancient Greek culture. It is well known that Hadrian adored Greek culture, and he changed many other cities in the Roman Empire to their erstwhile Greek names, in addition, outside of Palestine, right? So that's another possible explanation. So I think on the whole, there's no what we can say in summary is that there is no direct evidence of a decree. It could well have been dynamic evolution. And two, even if you accept that there was a decree, which again is speculation, it may well have been the case that the reason for that decree was because of his love for ancient Greek culture rather than his hatred for the Jews. So again, all of this is just mythology. It's just modern Zionists that are reading into history what they want to see into history, which is this time immemorial hatred of Jews and this time immemorial belief that Palestinians and even the word Palestine exists only to erase Jewish memory and Jewish history.
Very well put. I mean, I think it's such a good example, given the narrative that you see play out. The idea that Palestinian is some attempt at erasing Jewish history, when in fact I sort of see it as a name for the land that, in a lot of ways, has been an umbrella term that has passed through many different civilizations and many different periods of history to create a fairly intricate web of different groups of people that would eventually be woven together into this Palestinian identity. I want to zoom forwards to the Ottoman era. So Palestine, sort of immediately prior to, or in the early days of the Zionist movement, and I want to paint a picture of the fabric of society there. Maybe I'll let you speak a little to that, and then I want to delve into some of these regional identities and how it defined the individual Palestinian tribes, clans, and families that live there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wonder if it's worth just starting with a general picture of life in late Ottoman Palestine. So let's say 19th century, mid-19th century Ottoman Palestine. We're talking about a country of 400,000 people, perhaps. Most of them farmers. 3/4 of Palestine is farmers, right? We're talking about people who make a living from the land. The primary crops that they are growing are wheat and barley and fruits and vegetables, and olive oil is critical. They're producing soap and tobacco, and by the late 19th century, they're exporting oranges, which becomes the primary export crop out of Palestine by the eve of World War I. And so we're talking about a people whose entire identity, I would say, whose entire kind of worldview is based around the agricultural cycle. So in wealth in Ottoman Palestine is essentially a function of land ownership, and status in society is essentially a function of land ownership. And so you're talking about a people whose identity and whose livelihoods, whose entire, I would say, life is revolving around land. That proved to be an unfortunate coincidence in the decades to come, as land ownership in Palestine was the entire point of Zionism, was to take over the land. And now we're getting ahead of ourselves. But as I said, three-quarters of Palestine were peasants, were farmers, primarily concentrated in the mountainous interior. Nablus, Jenin, Hebron, Jerusalem, Bethlehem. These were the biggest population centers in Ottoman Palestine, much more so than the coastal plains of Jaffa and Haifa, which had smaller populations. We're talking about, I would say, a society that was in which the main divisions were probably between the rural population of farmers and the urban notables, who were the scribes and the religious leaders and the craftsmen and the civil servants and the merchants and the teachers. I would say that was the primary division between Ottoman, within Ottoman society, was between, basically the urban notables and the farmers themselves living in the countryside. I would say, in addition to that, we can point out that Palestine was something like 85% Muslim, 10% Christian, 5% Jewish. And I would say, generally speaking, there were positive relations between the religious communities. That's not to say there were no problems, but it is to say that, generally speaking, these communities got along. You have many anecdotes in the literature of Muslims and Christians celebrating holidays together. Muslims basically during the Nebi, they combined the Nebi Musa pilgrimage and celebration together with Easter. And so Christians and Muslims were celebrating, Easter and the Nebi Musa pilgrimage together. You have anecdotes where Christians and Muslims are joining Jews on picnics in Sheikh Jarrah, which is now currently in East Jerusalem. They were joining Jews who were celebrating at the tombstone of a Jewish scholar by the name of Shimon HaTzadik, which is still located in Sheikh Jarrah to this day. They were celebrating this Jewish holiday together with Jews. Then you have anecdotes of Christians and Muslims dressing up on the Jewish holiday of Purim, celebrating Purim together with Jews. You had Jews and Muslims and Christians living side by side in Jerusalem and Jaffa. In the Al-Wad neighborhood of Jerusalem, for example, you had something like 7 mosques, 2 synagogues, and 3 churches. You had Muslims and Jewish children playing in the same courtyards together. So overall, and then in Jaffa, of course, you had in Manshia, in the suburb of Jaffa, you had wealthy Jews and wealthy Palestinian Arabs building homes side by side. So we're talking about a society where, and then in addition to all that, you had the kind of an emerging Ottoman empire, an emerging Ottoman identity, already burgeoning in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in which Jews, Muslims, and Christians all felt this shared sense of Ottoman identity and celebrated all together the Ottoman Constitutional Revolution of 1908. We're talking Jews, Christians, and Muslims celebrating their Ottoman identity together, celebrating the Constitutional Revolution together, embracing a kind of Ottoman modernity together. So here I would say, in general, we have very positive relations between the religious communities, and there was no reason to believe that those positive relations wouldn't have persisted to this day had it not been for the Zionist movement, which really drove a wedge between the Ottoman Jews of Palestine and the Ottoman Muslims and Christians of Palestine. And maybe I'll pause there. I mean, there's so much to say about Ottoman Palestine, but maybe I'll pause there and you can kind of take this conversation in whichever direction you like.
Yeah, I want to unpack a few points there. One common thing that is brought up as a denial of kind of this non-sectarian nature of Ottoman era society are things like the 1834 looting of Safed. So a number of conflicts will be brought up throughout this history as a way to say, hey, it wasn't actually all kumbaya, and there was always sort of oppression or sectarian violence in the region. And it's such a poor reading of the history. Like you have something called the Qaisi-Yamani conflict, this intertribal conflict that existed throughout Palestine right up until the 19th century. In the case of Safed, the exact same clans and tribes that were at war there with villages that happened to be Jewish, that like weeks later went and attacked a Muslim village. It wasn't sectarian in nature. This was clan tribal warfare. My ancestors descend from two separate clans that warred with each other throughout Palestinian history, not along sectarian lines. So you generally have these like under the Ottomans, you have the Mutasalim structure, where the Ayyan families, the noble sort of clans and tribes, were acted as rural tax collectors or lords that would collect their taxes on behalf of the Ottoman Empire and sort of rule these regional areas in their stead. And a lot of these identities continue to this very day. So you see these really strong regional identities where Palestinians widely identify with the area that they're from. Qadha Nablus, Qadha Jenin, Qadha Haifa. These villages that would surround a throne village or a key town or city, as well as the individual village identity. And that was in many cases, the strongest identity. You can name various famous Palestinian families or clans that moved from one region to another, and hundreds of years after a family from Jenin would move to Nablus, they're still recognized as being from a specific village in Jenin. These identities, these village identities that are so intrinsically tied to the land, never really would go away. They would just form a part of who you are. And while there were a lot of feuds and a lot of conflicts inside of Ottoman era Palestinian society, I'm actually quite surprised at how little of them seem to play out along sectarian lines. I think it was something to do with the umbrella identity, as you're sort of pointing out, that was formed under the Ottoman Empire for a lot of different reasons. But it was, well, that era in history, it was sort of surprisingly idealistic. And I think in many ways that is the ideal that when Palestinians speak of liberation, we point back to, is this sort of Ottoman era pluralistic, non-sectarian society. And you would see this sort of later reemerge in the posters and the writings of Palestinian revolutionaries from the PLO to the PFLP. We'll sort of get to that later. But yeah, these ideas were sort of always present, that Palestine and Palestinian society is that of the people who live in the land, rather than denoting any particular, religious group. But I want to continue further and talk about Filasteen and Carmil newspaper. So when trying to read into this history, we can look at the press at the time. So what were people writing? What were Palestinians publishing? And the evolution of the Palestinian people's impression of the Zionist movement, from ambivalence, sort of, so to speak, in the beginning. So I wonder if you can speak a little to that.
Yeah, so I would really say that the first political expressions of the Arab population of Palestine first start to manifest themselves in the press, in the Arabic newspapers that start to get published in the aftermath of the 1908 Ottoman Constitutional Revolution. Recall that before 1908, you could not publish really a newspaper in Ottoman Palestine. Permits were denied to publish newspapers for the most part. There were some exceptions, but basically, if you want to look at organized political activity among Palestinians, I think first and foremost, you would start to see such activity emerge after that 1908 constitutional revolution, and after Arabs start to print and publish newspapers, when they start to enjoy real press freedoms, in Palestine. But even before that, I wonder if it's worth just pointing out that Najib Nassar, who was the editor and publisher of the newspaper Al-Carmil, one of the most anti-Zionist newspapers to emerge in the post-1908 period. So he actually is already publishing in Syrian and Egyptian papers long before 1908. For example, in 1901, he publishes an article in a magazine that is, I believe, published out of Alexandria, Egypt. And the title of his article is an Arabic article, but the translation is "A Palestinian Describes a Palestinian Town." So he is actually one of the first people, as far as I can tell, one of the first Arab Palestinians to explicitly define himself as a Palestinian in 1901. And in any case, 8 years later, he establishes a newspaper, Al-Carmil, and there have been a number of researchers who have written about this newspaper, and he is one of the most outspoken critics of Zionism. I think he is following along the developments in Europe. He knows about the Zionist congresses in Switzerland and Basel, in which the Jews of Europe are calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. So he's very well aware of this. And so he's a real critic of Zionism, and I believe together with Entebbe, another Palestinian intellectual in the period, he helps establish a Palestinian agricultural society, I believe in 1911, in which he calls for Arabs to buy up land to prevent it from falling into the hands of the Zionist immigrants and of the Zionist movement based in Europe. So that's kind of, I would say, a brief word or two on Najib Nasser and Al-Carmel. And then, of course, you have Filasteen, the newspaper.
Before we go into Filasteen, you spoke about Al-Carmel and sort of these being some of the first instances where Palestinians begin to refer to themselves as Palestinians in a distinctly sort of nationalist sense. So, you obviously have this long history of the land actually, being called Palestine, but then a series of different empires. So sort of different, I guess you could call it, national identities that are present, right up to this point where we're talking about the Ottoman Empire. How does that evolution occur? How does a group of people go from identifying with like a broader empire and then maybe seeing Palestine as a regional or provincial, administrative, perhaps, identity that would have been maintained, Jund Filasteen under the caliphates, or maybe Hadith scholars referencing people as Palestinian in sort of regional origin. How does that evolution occur to, by the time you get to 1901, where there is a sort of deep nationalist notion of being Palestinian, of belonging to this land as a people?
Yeah, so prior to the mid-19th century, it is quite difficult to find very many Arabic speakers of Palestine in the 16th or 17th or 18th or early to mid-19th century calling themselves Palestinians. I haven't found any. I don't think they were calling themselves Palestinians. Of course, you go back to the 10th century and you do find at least one Arabic source, Al-Maqdisi, in the 10th century calls himself Palestinian. And as you pointed out, over the course of the intervening 900 years, from about the 10th century to the 19th century, you do have actually many Hadith scholars in the Hadith literature who are referred to as Filastini, owing to this tradition, the Isnad tradition of basically identifying not just who the person was that transmitted the Hadith, but also where they were from. And of course,
the nature of their character and whatnot. Yeah.
Exactly. And so because you had June Filasteen was a district in the early Islamic period for hundreds of years, there were many Hadith transmitters who were from June Filasteen. And so their appellation was Filastini. And so the term does appear in Arabic sources before the 19th century. But it's not until, I would say, the mid to late 19th century that you start to see the term appear to describe the region's modern current inhabitants. The first source I've been able to locate to describe Palestine's Arabic-speaking inhabitants as Palestinians is actually James Finn, who is the British consul in Jerusalem. And in his 1870 memoir, he describes the Arabs of Palestine as Palestinians. You also have a number of American and German sources in the 1880s and early 1890s who also are using that term. The first Arabic source I've been able to find in which an Arab of Palestine is using that term, Filastini, to describe very casually, very nonchalantly, very unconsciously the people of Palestine, is Khalil Bedas in 1898. And I think so Khalil Bedas is the first in 1898. The second is, as I already mentioned, Najib Nasser in 1901. And the third is Salim Kubain, who also publishes an article titled "A Palestinian Describes a Palestinian Town," also publishing in that same Alexandrian journal in 1901. And I think when you look at the backgrounds of these three individuals, Najib Nasser, Salim Kubain, and Khalil Bedas, what becomes obvious is they all went to the same high school, interestingly enough. Okay, like there should be, red flags flying, right? Because that's quite an interesting coincidence, if it was in fact a coincidence. Of course, I don't think it was a coincidence. I think this school that they all went to was the Russian Teachers Training Seminary in Nazareth, which opens in the mid to late 1880s, I believe. And basically, if you look at the curriculum and you look at what they're teaching in the school, it's pretty obvious why these are the first people to identify as Palestinian. They're probably studying with books of history called The History of Palestine. They seem to be studying using geography books called The Geography of Palestine. There's evidence to believe there were maps of Palestine circulating in the schools, perhaps hung on the school classroom walls. They're also taken on trips around the holy sites of Palestine, right? They're taken to to the Sea of Galilee, and they're taken to Bethlehem and to Jerusalem, to the holy sites. In addition to all that, they're taken out of their home environments. These are high school kids, we're talking kids ages, let's say 12, 13, 14, all the way to age 18. And so they're taken out of their home environments in this environment where they're kind of being able to explore new identities. They're being taught about the history of Palestine, the geography of Palestine, the holy sites of Palestine. In addition to all that, they're being encouraged to wear Arabic dress rather than Western dress. And they're being taught Arabic literature and Arabic language. Right. So they're being taught to embrace their own Arab Palestinian identities. Lo and behold, these are the first people that start to call themselves Palestinians. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's because of the environment in which they were raised, the environment in which they were being taught. In addition to all that, they're being taken out of their homes, in this new environment where they're able to explore new identities. So that is at least how I would explain the origins of a Palestinian identity in the late Ottoman period. I think education is critical. Of course, it's not just the Russian Teachers Training Seminary in Nazareth, right? There are many, many schools around Palestine that are doing similar things, that are teaching with similar books and using a similar curriculum. I would point out the St. George's School, the British St. George's School in Jerusalem being another one of these. There's a French school in Jaffa that is probably teaching similar things. There are Ottoman schools that are also teaching similar things. If you look at the Ottoman textbooks that were used in Muslim schools, right? These are primarily Muslims going to these Ottoman schools. You find similar things. They're using geography books with the maps of Palestine in them. They're using history books that have sections on the history of Palestine. There are Ottoman maps circulating in the Ottoman schools, which explicitly refer to Palestine on the maps. So I think this is pretty much a kind of a very clear evidence that you start to see a Arab identity, an Arab Palestinian identity emerging in 1880s, 1890s, 1900s in Palestine, among both Muslims as well as Christians and question mark Jews, and we can get into that. But it's not obvious Jews identified as Palestinian. It's definitely possible. But anyways, I would say late 19th, early 20th century, Muslims and Christians start to call themselves Palestinians for the reasons we just discussed.
What was the interplay between the emergence of these ideas and Pan-Arabism? So I look at George Antonius and the early Pan-Arabist movement, and it seems like an attempt at finding a common thread. I mean, the early Pan-Arabists were Christians, generally speaking. So it seems like an attempt to find a common thread, a uniting identity between a region that has multiple religions, Druze, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Alawite, Shia, Sunni. So a sort of unifying identity that carves out a different nation for the people who live there that is secular, and so or non-sectarian, doesn't sort of exclude any particular religious identity and form a common theme between them, despite the fact that the definition of who is ethnically Arab is fairly loose. That effectively, this same thing would be applied to the Armenian population there, so long as they spoke Arabic. There's a notion of being Arabized purely by virtue of embracing the language and then to an extent the culture, and integrating, not even really assimilating, just integrating into the fabric of this, clan, regional, tribal society.
Yeah, so I would say that in order to understand any intellectual development in Palestine in the 19th or even the 18th or the early 20th century, you cannot divorce Palestine from the rest of the Arab world. Palestine was part and parcel of the intellectual developments that were taking place in the Arab Middle East in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the most important of which was the Nahda, the Renaissance, in which Arabs in Egypt and in Iraq and in Syria and Lebanon and elsewhere around the Arab world experienced this literary revival. The explosion in the number of books and magazines and newspapers being printed and published in the Arab world is it really, I would say, really picks up in the late 19th century, and Palestine is very much a part of that. You have a newspaper, a magazine called Al-Muqtataf, published out of Beirut, I believe, beginning in the late 1870s. And that magazine is getting imported to throughout all of Palestine. You have a very interesting piece, I believe, by Ami Ayalon has published a piece on this, and at the end of each each issue of this magazine Al Muqtataf, you have all of the subscribers that are listed, even according to which cities they're in, and you have many Palestinians, Arab Palestinians, throughout the 1880s and 90s, subscribing to this Beiruti publication. Throughout even small towns in Palestine, you have many subscribers, and this magazine is talking a lot about it's publishing reports on what is happening in Palestine, on what is happening in Egypt, and what is happening in Syria. Of course, it's talking about the Urabi revolt in Egypt in 1882, where you get the slogan, Egypt is for the Egyptians. Lo and behold, by the 20th century, you have Syrians saying the same thing. Syria is for the Syrians. And then in 1925, you have Khalil Sakakini write in his a book he publishes in 1925. He says Palestine is for the Palestinians. So this is not a coincidence. The Arab world is one unit in the sense that everyone is speaking the same language. Everyone is reading the same publications. It's interconnected also via a transit. You can take a train from Beirut to Haifa to Gaza to Cairo. Already by the 1890s, I believe. So the Arab world is quite interconnected, and so what happens in Cairo and Damascus and Beirut echoes in Jerusalem and Jaffa and Nablus.
And the sharing of a common language that allows for these ideas to cross-pollinate across, what would later become the Sykes-Picot borders, because these people were not separated from each other.
That's exactly right. And to the specific question around kind of Arab, an emerging, I would say, Arab nationalism, I would say this happened in parallel to an emergence of a Palestinian Arab identity, and in parallel to the emergence of an Egyptian identity, and in parallel to the emergence of a Lebanese and a Syrian identity. These were two intellectual streams that I don't think the contemporaries believed there was anything contradictory within them. You had many Palestinians play key roles. For example, in the literary clubs that were established in Istanbul, that you had all these Arab clubs that were founded in the first decade and a half of the 20th century, both in Istanbul and in Damascus and in Beirut, and many Palestinians were part of those Arab clubs. Talking about the importance of Arabic language and Arabic culture and Arabic literature, advocating for the establishment of Arabic as the official language in the Ottoman schools in Palestine, which was actually not the case. They were teaching Ottoman and were using the Ottoman language, and there was a push to introduce Arabic language into those schools. And then, of course, the Arab movement during World War I, of course, in which you have an Arab revolt and you have an Arabic kingdom established in Damascus. It's not well appreciated. But Faisal, his kingdom in Damascus, if you look at his inner circle and the most important advisors to Faisal's Arabic kingdom, most of them were Palestinian. This is not well appreciated. Aouni Abdul Hadi played an important role in his government. There were many Palestinians that played a very important role in that Arabic kingdom in Damascus. And of course, long after the fall of that government in 1920, long after the French brutally suppress and violently overthrow this Arabic kingdom and establish a French colonial government in its place, you have many Palestinians throughout the 1920s and 1930s advocating for Arab unity. Advocating for this greater Syrian concept, or advocating for even perhaps an even greater Arab kingdom, that might stretch from Egypt all the way to Iraq. But basically, you have a very powerful attempt to encourage Arabic language and literature in schools, as well as a political movement to bring about some kind of Arabic kingdom in the aftermath of World War I. And then I would say that Arabic movement continues in the form of this kind of pan-Arabism, and you might even say kind of a pan-Syrianism as well in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s.
to circle back to the Palestinian press, we spoke about kind of how the evolution all the way up to, Al-Carmil, as sort of this loudly anti-Zionist newspaper. The other paper that is very relevant is Filasteen. So you had Isa al-Issa and his cousin, Yusuf al-Issa, begin to publish a newspaper, I think in 1911 in Jaffa, as a weekly publication dealing with, Ottoman politic, so to speak. And the evolution of their writings in relation to Zionism is very interesting to witness. So you have this initial ambivalence, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts about that in a moment. You have this initial sort of ambivalence. Palestinians are not aware of the threat the Zionist movement poses. I mean, one, we're really talking about the Palestinian elite here. So the Ayyan families, the notables. And this is sort of always the case, if you go all the way back to the 1834 revolts against Muhammad Ali Pasha, you're talking about rallying these Palestinian clans in order to have an uprising. And that's kind of generally the fabric of Palestinian society. You had rebellions and independent rule of clans like my namesake, Zahir Zaydani, the Jarrars, the Tukhans, the Nimmers, the Husseinis, the Nashashibis. So these notable sort of clans and families, the Palestinian elite, being the most heavily involved in Palestinian politics. And then the Fallahin, the majority of the Palestinian population, being less aware, but being kind of the first to suffer the consequences, the first to be kicked off their land with the purchase of land from absentee landlords, etc. And you see this evolution in Palestine newspaper, where over time, Isa al-Issa begins to write more and more hostile articles about the Zionist movement, right up until he gets taken to court. So there is a court case by the Ottomans for effectively sowing discord among society. And it's very interesting to read how he tested. He won the case, and it's very interesting to read how he testified, him and his cousin. The speech he gave was basically Zionist is not the same as Jew. That these two things are entirely separate. That he has love for his Jewish brothers. That he was not opposed to Jewish a presence in Palestine per se. That it was specifically the Zionist movement, which was a political party whose aim is to restore Palestine to their nation, concentrate them in it, and to keep it exclusively for them. And that sort of seems to be the first point at which you have this like clear articulation, Al-Carmil and Filasteen newspaper, this clear articulation of the Palestinian opposition to Zionism. And we've had many other groups of people come to the land. You have the Armenian population, you have a number of migrations of groups that actually retained a fairly strong independent identity, or even different, sometimes in religious character. So it's not even about assimilation per se, but were integrated into Palestinian society. They went to the same schools. They kind of operated within the same ecosystem and eventually spoke the same language. The Zionist movement, on the other hand, wasn't interested in immigrating to Palestine and being part of Palestinian society. It was interested in building a nation exclusively for one ethno-religious group, and specifically trying to be a demographic majority, which could only be achieved with ethnic cleansing, and this would later result in the Nakba. I guess, how do you see the evolution of Palestinian thinking to the Zionist movement? How do we respond to them initially? Why weren't Palestinians more readily immediately aware of the threat the Zionist movement posed? And how long did it take before it sort of became a mainstream hostility, between these factions?
Well, I would say, first of all, there were a lot of movements of foreigners in the late Ottoman period beyond Zionism, and it wasn't obvious Zionism and the Zionist movement was the one that was going to win out. You had the German Templars, and you had many thousands of Germans who moved to Palestine in the late 19th century. Again, similar idea of creating these kind of foreign colonies in the Holy Land. You had many Europeans as well talking about a European takeover of Palestine, which happened in 1920, or rather 1918. But And of course, you have the Zionists as well. And I think that's one of the reasons why not just the Arabs the Palestinian Arabs were not immediately, let's say, alarmed by it, but also the Ottomans themselves were not alarmed by it. There were so many of these movements that it wasn't obvious which movement would eventually win out. But I think already from I would even say the 1890s, you can identify already violence between Jews and Arabs already in the 1880s. And the reasons are usually the same. It's that you have Zionists who are migrating to Palestine. I believe the first outbreak of violence happens already in the 1880s in Petah Tikva, where basically Jews buy land from absentee landlords who live in Beirut or Haifa or Jaffa or somewhere else, and they displace the Palestinian farmers that are living there.
And the farmers would often not want to register the land for fear of, being taxed on it, or having to, conscription and a number of other legal consequences, and then they, as a result, would be kicked off their land.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the process by which all of these urban notables ended up buying up and owning all the land in Ottoman Palestine is like a whole other conversation, but you're exactly right. That as the Ottoman Empire privatized land in the mid to late 19th century, beginning in the 1850s, peasants were rightfully worried that if they were to register their land, they would be conscripted, and that they would be taxed, overtaxed. And they were absolutely right about both of those things. And so they had a fear of registering their land. And so they, in many cases, basically allowed these urban notables to register the land for them. And so they eventually found themselves in a state of dispossession when Zionists bought the land from these absentee landlords. But in any case, they get displaced. And this happens in the 1880s in the coastal plains. It's happening in the 1890s in the Galilee. And then to bring us back to the establishment of the newspaper Filasteen in 1911, there's an incident in 1910, 1911 in Afula, which is in the north, in which it's a similar story. You have a Zionist, they buy land from, I believe, the Sarsuks, it's a very wealthy Lebanese family based in Beirut, and they buy this land from the Sarsuks, and the Palestinian farmers living on the land refuse to leave. And this leads to an outbreak of violence. And I think it's these incidents of violence where Zionists take over land, Palestinians get displaced. And this is basically, I think, a red flag to all of these intellectuals, including the Issa cousins. And I think it's the Afulu incident that really convinces them that Zionism is not the movement they thought it was. Recall that in the early period of the newspaper, there was actually an alliance between a Zionist writer and the Issa cousins themselves. And it was a controversial alliance, right? Because the Zionism was already a known quantity in Ottoman Palestine, and it was already a good deal of hostility towards it.
And Carmil sort of predated Filasteen newspaper. They were the first on the anti-Zionist bandwagon.
Exactly. It wasn't entirely obvious to many Palestinians that the Zionists had the intention of really taking over the country and subjecting its native inhabitants to political subjugation. And so there was maybe a belief that, the Zionists were, potentially interested in integration and assimilation. And I think that was partly why they established this. They basically employed this Zionist writer in the first year or so of the newspaper's establishment, in part to based on the shared Ottoman identity and shared Ottoman belief that, hey, we're all in this Ottoman thing together. And again, if the Ottoman Empire persisted, you might have imagined a world in which the Zionist movement would have integrated into some kind of Ottoman Palestine. But obviously that history didn't turn out that way. But all that is to say that at some point the editors of Filasteen, I think, realized that Zionism was not a friend of the Arab community of Palestine, and the Zionists had ill intentions towards the native population. And so by 1912, 1913, you start to see much more hostility in the newspaper. And I would say by 1914, the newspaper was probably as anti-Zionist as Carmil. And so, and that newspaper, of course, is being distributed to the towns and villages around Palestine. We have many anecdotes of a villager reading the newspaper aloud in a village cafe in Khan Yunis or in Salfit in the West Bank. So you have basically these anecdotes of villagers reading aloud Palestinian newspapers in village cafes, kind of, awakening the masses, educating the people who are previously probably not super aware of what Zionism was or what their intentions were. So you do have, I think, a very widespread belief already by the eve of World War I that Zionism represents a true danger to the Palestinian people. And of course, that becomes all the more obvious in the years after the war, after the British take over Palestine and implement the Balfour Declaration, which is essentially a blueprint for transforming Palestine from
and sort of a vindication as well. So you have these people who are sounding the alarm, Carmil, Filasteen newspaper afterwards, about the Zionist movement, and then Balfour is the Balfour Declaration is the proof that they were right all along, that this really is the trajectory in which the country has headed, that the Zionist movement truly intends to establish a Jewish homeland here, and the Palestinian population effectively referred to and reduced to non-Jewish minorities.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
On the subject of integration and kind of these dynamics that would play out, I want to talk a little bit about the Muslim-Christian Association and the fact that was the group that would have these early negotiations, these conferences or talks with the Jewish Agency and the early Zionist movement, and the kind of demands that the Palestinian population had of the movement. Things like integrating in the same schools. I don't know if you want to talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, so in the aftermath of the British occupation of Palestine, you see many Palestinians organizing political associations. So you get these Muslim Christian associations, and they are the primary, I would say, organizations driving these congresses that become known as the first Palestinian Arab Congress in 1919, the second Palestinian Arab Congress in 1921, the third in 1922, and they go for 6, 7, 8 years. And they passed resolutions essentially calling out the British for their duplicity and their cynicism. These national congresses basically say, look, the British, hear you guys talk about self-determination, and they're quoting, for example, Woodrow Wilson's 14-point speech, in which he declares that the nations of the world have a right to self-determination. And they're calling out the French Anglo declarations of 1918, in which the British themselves say the free peoples of the world have a right to self-determination. And they're saying, look, you guys in all of these declarations claim that peoples and have the right to self-determination, but here you come to Palestine and are denying us that same right. And so they're calling for what essentially democracy. They're saying, look, how about you allow us to elect our own representatives? And by us, they mean the Christian, the Jewish, and the Muslim inhabitants of Palestine before World War I. And they say, look, let us establish our own government. And the British, of course, reject those petitions. They reject those protest notes because the British have a different plan for Palestine. They want to transform Palestine from an Arab Muslim country to a Jewish country, to encourage Zionist immigration and Zionist land purchases, which is totally at odds with the indigenous inhabitants. Right, in 1919. The American King Crane Commission comes to Palestine. It's this commission that is brought to Palestine in the spirit of democracy, in the spirit of Woodrow Wilson's 14-point speech, in which the native inhabitants of Palestine are surveyed. What do you hope for Palestine after the war? And 85% reject Zionism. Almost 90% support basically unity with Syria, unity with that independent Arabic kingdom in Damascus. And so there's a rejection of Zionism, but of course the British don't care about what the Arabs think. They don't care about democracy. They care about their own imperial interests, which include establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. And we can get into why they think that is in their own imperial interest. I mean, that's a whole other conversation. But yeah, they basically reject these, the nonviolent political demonstrations of the Palestinian people. You might even say that these congresses, the Palestinian Arab Congresses from 1919 to 1926, are, the first instances of like Palestinian nonviolent resistance. and it's completely ignored. They're not even treated seriously. They're given no power. These are organized entirely in a grassroots way. They're not sanctioned by British officials. The British create their own parallel set of institutions for the Arabs of Palestine, which are not Palestinian Arab institutions like the Palestinian Arab Congresses are. They're Muslim and Christian institutions, which is how the Balfour Declaration defines the inhabitants as religious communities, right? Because they want to depoliticize them. They want to denationalize them. And so they empower Muslim leaders in the Muslim Supreme Council, which they give to Hajj Amin al-Husseini. And they create Christian institutions similarly. But they want to basically deny the Arabs a kind of a political identity, a national identity.
How did the distinction emerge? At what point do you see, to use sort of Zionist terminology, you have the new Yishuv and the old Yishuv. You have a Jewish population in Palestine that I'm not sure to what extent identified with the sort of broader Palestinian narrative. I know at least a few instances where they did. But how did that evolve? You have this population that is living side by side with Muslim, Christian, Druze, other members of Palestinian society, and while there is tribal and clan conflict and warfare, it's not really heavily along sectarian fault lines. How does the old Yishuv, how does the original sort of Jewish I'm going to refer to them as Palestinian. I'm, for simplicity, anybody who lived in the land sort of prior to the Zionist movement. So how does the Palestinian Jewish population relate to the Zionist movement? How do they react to it initially, and at what point do they sort of end up on the sort of on the same side? How does that evolution occur?
It's a great question, and it's not well understood. But I would generally say the native Jews of Palestine on the eve of Zionist immigration, you could say fell into two categories of Jews. It's roughly half were Ashkenazi and half were Sephardi. The Ashkenazi Jews primarily spoke Yiddish, so we're talking 40% of the quote unquote native Jews. I mean, I know it's a little bit weird to think about native, Jews of Palestine as Ashkenazi Yiddish speakers, but recall that over the course of the 19th century, there were movements of Jews to Palestine.
Prior migrations, right?
There were prior migrations. Zionism, the late 19th century was not the first time Jews had the idea of moving to Palestine. There were sporadic migrations before that. And so you had 40% spoke Yiddish, were Ashkenazi. You had 40% who spoke Ladino, which is basically a kind of a Judeo-Spanish. But of those that spoke Ladino, the 40% who spoke Ladino, the vast majority of them spoke Arabic as a second language, but not as a native language. So I think it's important. And so they were focused in primarily four cities: Jerusalem, Tiberias, Safed, and Hebron, and a very small community in Jaffa as well. And I would say, generally speaking, it was the maybe contrary to what you might have guessed, it was actually the Sephardi Jews, the ones who spoke Judeo-Spanish, and who spoke Arabic. They actually grew increasingly closer to the foreign Zionist community, more so than the Ashkenazis did. And I don't think that's well appreciated. For example, you had many very prominent native Jews, Sephardi Jews of Palestine, Nissim Malul, Shimon Moyel, Avraham Elimelech, I believe, Gad Frumkin. Maybe Gad Frumkin was Ashkenazi, but the other three were Sephardi Jews. They spoke Arabic, and they were very much Zionists. The Ashkenazi Jews, on the other hand, actually, I would say, it was more likely that an Ashkenazi native Jew of Palestine would be opposed to the Zionist movement.
Why is that? What was the reason behind that distinction?
So that would be for religious reasons.
Right.
So the Ashkenazi Jews were much more religious. Remember, the reason they were probably in Palestine in the first place was owing to some kind of, religious migration, owing to some belief that, living in the Holy Land, living in the land of Israel was a very spiritual thing, and it was very important for their religious, spiritual religious growth. They wanted to live in the land of Israel. And so actually they, for the most part, they rejected Zionism for the same reason you have 100,000 ultra-Orthodox Jews today rejecting Zionism, which is to say that they believed and still believe, many ultra-Orthodox do today, that only God can bring about the second coming, the coming of the Messiah, and anything that human beings do to try to pull forward that future, to try to kind of hasten the coming of the Mashiach, anything Jews
Defiant of God's will.
is actually a violation of Torah law. You're actually
Right.
committing a sin by doing that. And so Zionism, the Zionist movement, to try and get all the Jews in the world to move to Israel, that is only supposed to happen, again, according to Orthodox Jews, that is only supposed to happen in the end of days when the Mashiach comes. And so essentially they interpret this Zionist movement as a violation of God's will, because it's an attempt to hasten, to bring forward the future, to basically kind of, do what only God is supposed to do. It's divine. You're supposed to wait for divine intervention rather than human action. And so they rejected Zionism for that reason. And I would say the third reason, or maybe a second or third reason why there was tension between the foreign Jews, basically the Zionist immigrants, and the native Jews, was because they competed over philanthropic dollars. You have to remember that the Jewish community in Palestine on the eve of Zionist immigration was significantly dependent on foreign donations. You'd have, basically this community would go around the world. Before Zionism, they would make trips to Eastern Europe, make trips to Western Europe, and try to collect donations for the Jewish community of Palestine. And now there was there's competition because now Jews were now donating, to the Zionist movement rather than to the indigenous Jewish inhabitants of Palestine.
And that first wave of migration, that first Aliyah went bankrupt and had to be bailed out by philanthropists, by foreign donations in order to survive. You speak about the Sephardic Ashkenazi distinction, and I'm just trying to categorize this in my mind. So when I look at the history, at various points, the Syrian and Iraqi Jews had, the Jews in particular in Damascus and Baghdad, had a strong relationship both between Syria and Iraq on trade routes across the Levant, across Palestine, Syria, and at a number of points in history, Palestinian leaders, tribal leaders or Layan notables, had promoted Jewish immigration to Palestine. This is long before the advent of Zionism, for economic reasons. They saw mercantile benefits to their migration there, to them setting up businesses and sort of investing and forming these trade routes. Where would they fit in this categorization, if at all?
Yeah, you had many Jewish communities around the Ottoman world, outside of Palestine. I mean, Palestine was, I would say, among the Jewish communities in the Ottoman Empire, was among the smallest. Right? You had big Jewish communities in Iraq, which was a very important Ottoman province. 40% of Baghdad was Jewish. People forget this, but Baghdad, the Jews played as important a role in Iraqi politics and Iraqi culture and Iraqi food and Iraqi music as any other, Iraqis. So, Jews were very well integrated into Iraq. The same, I would say, was true of Anatolia, of what became modern Turkey. You had large Jewish communities in Izmir, of course, in Istanbul, and other parts of Anatolia as well. I was visiting Gaziantep. You have a beautiful synagogue in Gaziantep. I mean, you have basically Jewish communities all around. You had big Jewish communities in Damascus, in Beirut, obviously in Cairo and Alexandria. Jews played very prominent roles throughout the Arab and Muslim lands. Now I forget your exact question, though. Sorry.
Oh, just how they were different. So, for example, I look at the Baghdad Jewish population and some of the notables there, and they were, in the beginning, staunchly anti-Zionist. They were significantly more predisposed to embracing pan-Arab ideas. So, seeing themselves as Arab in identity versus the Ashkenazi and Sephardic population. And then, as you mentioned, sort of in this early period, religious Zionism, the Otzma Yehudit, the Ben Gvirs and the Smotriches of the world, that hadn't been accepted yet. So the religious orthodoxy was opposed to the Zionist movement, and then which sort of left the Sephardic population that saw the movement as a natural ally. But then the Syrian, Iraqi, and I'm not sure to what extent other Mizrahi populations identified more as intrinsically Arab, or an intrinsic part of the fabric of those societies. I was just curious as to why that was the case, but we can move beyond that as well.
Look, the only thing I would say is that Zionism created a wedge between the Jewish Arabs and the societies in which they were living. And all Jews had to deal with that wedge. Obviously, many of them embraced Zionism. They saw Zionism as a legitimate political movement that was, a kind of national liberal, national self-determination movement of self-determination and liberation. And that was a very common view among many Jewish communities around the world. There were also many Jews who said, this is causing us problems in our home countries. Right, this was the case throughout the in many Jews in Iraq. You have an anti-Zionist league form in Iraq in the 1940s. You have the chief rabbi of Egypt, I believe, Rabbi Nahum, I believe was his name, in the 1940s, come out very staunchly against Zionism and say, look, this movement is not in our interests. It is causing us problems. We are a very well entrenched community in Egypt. We are prominent in Egypt. We do not want to have anything to do with this movement. And so I would say, but regardless of where Jews landed on this question, it put Jews in a quagmire. It forced them to kind of choose sides. Do we support, the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, or do, in which case, we're going to have to live with the consequences of that, or do we kind of reject it and say, no, we are happy where we are? And it really created, I would say, tension in many Jewish communities around the world, not just in the Arab Middle East and in the Muslim Middle East, but also in Europe and the United States.
Yeah, and there's a whole other conversation to be had about the active role the Zionist movement played in driving that wedge in further. I want to talk briefly before we get closer to the sort of 48 war about the attempts at healing the wedge, or the Palestinian demands, or what would now be the legacy of Palestinian demands. So the Muslim Christian Association, a lot of it was very interesting reading some of these negotiations. A lot of their demands was simply centered around sharing institutions. So rather than there being sort of separate schools, separate organizations and communities, just attend the same schools as us, integrate into our society, and then later, when you have the Istiqlal party form, be part of the same national project as the rest of the native population. But even all the way down to the 30s with the AHC, it was very interesting reading what Palestinians were willing to accept. So the AHC was willing to allow immigration, Jewish immigration into Palestine to be as high as, I think it was like 40 or 45%, but were entirely opposed to partition in every sense of the word. And I think that to this very day much better describes the Palestinian opposition to Zionism. The whole idea that you're going to form a state for one ethno-religious group of people at the exclusion of the rest of the population, and frankly the majority of the native population, and the fact that there was no means by which you could establish the state without the violent displacement of Palestinians. Could that wedge ever have been healed, or is it fundamentally at odds with the goals of the Zionist project?
I think there were a number of things the Zionists did in the first half of the 20th century that led to this kind of hostility towards partition and towards the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, because the Arabs and the Palestinians knew what was probably in store for them if they allowed that. Because the Zionists were explicit about what their goals and what their intentions were. You might say the pillars of Zionism were Jewish labor. That is to say, Jews would not hire Arabs. There was a movement in the first half of the 20th century among the Zionists to hire only Jews. I mean, imagine today, if you had a sign in front of your shop that said, "We only hire Jews." I mean, it's, we did have those signs. It was, "We only hire whites." And, thank God we're beyond that point. But basically, that was the Zionist take on things. It was a return to Jewish labor, that we're not going to, we're we're going to toil the soil ourselves. We're not going to hire Palestinian laborers. We are going to toil the soil ourselves. And of course, not just on farms and on the kibbutzim and moshavim, but also in the cities. It also, in the shops and in the factories. Zionists said, we will only hire other Jews. And so, of course, Palestinian Arabs were frightened by this. And then it wasn't just a labor, it was also land. The goal was Jewish ownership of land, right? The goal was, we want to own all the land in this country. Well, so essentially the goal was to dispossess Palestinians of their land. Obviously they want to do it legally. They don't want that bloodshed. They don't want resistance. They want to do it quietly at night. They want to do it without, basically within the terms of the mandate. So they lobby the British to change the laws to make it easier to dispossess Palestinians, right? So they're trying to always work within the frameworks, within the laws and the regulations and the ordinances of the Ottoman period first, and then the British period second. But they ultimately want to take control over land, and they want to take control over labor, and they ultimately want to take control over state institutions, right? So they're building a labor union, the Histadrut. They are building a defense forces, the Haganah, already, which is, you could say is first established already in 1908, and then develops in the 1920s and 30s. And you could say is basically almost already a formal militia by the 1940s. They're building institutions of statehood. They have a legislative body. They have an executive committee. They have a land administration, the JNF, which is now part of the state of Israel. So they're creating all these institutions of statehood, and they're all completely, for the purpose of Jewish, basically Jewish prosperity, Jewish development, Jewish domination, Jewish land purchases, Jewish labor, Jewish control. That's the whole point, is to create a Jewish state where Jews control everything, where Jews dominate everything, where Jews have own all the land and control all the labor. And if you're a Palestinian Arab, like what place do you have in that state, right? So no Palestinian wants to be left in a state like that. And so no Palestinian wants to partition Palestine into multiple states, in which the Palestinians will be 45% minority in the Jewish state. So that is totally antithetical to the interests of every Palestinian. So of course they reject, Zionism, Zionist control, Zionist majority, Zionist domination, partition. So I would say that is an outcome and an outgrowth of the Zionist movement itself, which was hell-bent on Jewish domination and Jewish control from its origins in the late 19th century all the way to the present day.
I think from those roots, you can best articulate what is happening in the present day. Palestinians have this identity that began to weave together a number of regional identities. The people of Ramle had a very distinct notion of Palestine. The people of Haifa had a regional identity. In each village, Palestinians to this very day will define their family and their history around the exact village they're from. It's actually pretty much the first identity that people would hold to. It was the strongest sense of belonging, and it would stay true even hundreds of years after Palestinians would move from one area to another. You can see it in the tatreez, the Palestinian embroidery, the different wedding traditions, the maqams, the shrines that exist in various Palestinian villages, that form these intrinsic regional identities. And then the idea that I, a Palestinian from Nablus or Jenin, I'm going to tell a Palestinian from Haifa that you have to get out, and then basically you're going to be part of this state that does not recognize you as part of the fabric of its character. And then I get to have a state over here in my, modern day 1967 borders. Like Palestinian nationalism emerged naturally as a number of other nationalist movements emerged, but it was never so much, there was sort of no real parallel to Zionism, which saw this Jewish nationalist movement as some kind of a way to save, as like a solution to the conundrum of the Dreyfus affair, that this is the only way forwards for the Jewish people. For Palestinians, it was just a natural consequence of the removal of the Ottoman era, and then the Istiqlal movement, a desire to define a national project for the native population that live in the land. And early Palestinian liberation movements were so clear about this. You know, by the time we get to the PLO and the PFLP, George Habash, Ghassan Kanfani, the early founders of Fatah, all of these revolutionary and liberation movements were really clear about what they wanted. You know, a democratic, unitary, non-sectarian state. You know, you look at the posters and it would have a crescent, a cross, and a menorah. Trying to sort of sell the entire population on this idea that there is no reason to, you know, carve up this land, and trying to conjure up this pre-Nakba sort of pre-Zionist movement society, this pluralistic society where we did not exist along these sectarian fault lines, and to return to a time where that was the land, and for Palestinian refugees to return home. But to get to that point, I want to talk a little bit about the lead up to 48, and then what happened during the Nakba.
So I think the lead up to 1948 really begins in the aftermath of the Great Palestinian Arab Revolt, which lasts from 1936 to 1939, in which the Palestinians, after having pursued nonviolent means of resistance for 2 decades, from the end of World War I until 1936, decide that didn't seem to do much of anything. We achieved no political results. Zionist immigration has only increased. By 1936, you had more than 40,000 Zionists migrating to Palestine every year for 4 years. You know, really during the mid 1930s is when the period of Zionist immigration really ramped up, for obvious reasons, right? Because of the rise of Nazism in Germany. And so the Palestinians decide to pick up arms and revolt against the British. And it's an absolutely gruesome revolt in which the British, you know, suppress Palestinians violently, kill something like 5,000 Palestinians, imprison or exile the vast majority of the Palestinian Arab leadership. And so what you have in the aftermath of the revolt is a people that are basically leaderless, right? They're, you know, the Arab Higher Committee is now operating in exile. You know, Hajam al-Husseini is also in exile. Aoun Abdul Hadi is in exile. You know, most of the Palestinian nationalists are now living in Beirut or in Turkey or in Syria or somewhere else. And so by 1940, and then the British decide, you know what, this revolt it's pretty strong evidence that we cannot pursue this policy of unlimited Zionist immigration forever. That is clearly causing problems and leading to bloodshed. So the British imposed restrictions on Zionist immigration, beginning with that white paper issued, I believe, is in 1939, and say I think something like 40 or 50,000 Zionists are allowed to immigrate to Palestine over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, and that leads to the rise of Jewish terrorism in Palestine, right? So you get all these, you know, Zionist gangs like the Lehi militia, who start to carry out all these terrorist attacks against the British. In one case, in 1946, they blow up the King David Hotel and kill something like 96 innocent people. And so you have the rise of Jewish terrorism. And then by 1947, the British are like, you know what, to hell with this Palestine thing. The age of empire is winding down. The British have already left India. They're abandoning their colonies all around the world. And so they say, you know what, Palestine, we're going to let the UN decide what to do with this place. And you get this resolution, the partition plan of 1947. Immediately afterwards, war breaks out because we already talked about why Arabs were so hostile to partition, and so you get war in Palestine, and you know, for the first, let's call it 6 months, you have basically a war between the Jewish community of Palestine and the Arab Palestinian community of Palestine, and it's during this period from roughly November 1947 until, let's say, roughly May 1948, in which the Zionist forces embrace Plan Dalet, which is basically a blueprint to expel Palestinian Arabs from their homes, driving them into exile. And over the course of the war, as you well know, you know, 750,000 Palestinians become refugees. And in the year and a half after the war, Zionist forces, now Israeli forces, shoot anyone trying to return to their homes after the war, as refugees so often do, and kill another thousand, maybe as many as 2,000 Palestinians in the year and a half, 2 years after the war. And so yeah, that I think your question was more about the lead up to the 48 war, but now we kind of went through the war.
Well, I mean, even you sort
yeah.
of have this civil war period, and like one of the causes belli for the attacking Arab armies was the fact that prior to a single Arab soldier stepping foot in Palestine, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had been violently expelled from their homes. So the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians had already begun.
Yeah, that's exactly correct.
That leads up to sort of the Nakba of 48. I mean, putting aside the fact that the partition itself was sort of inherently unfair in terms of the ratio of the land given, the percentage of actual land ownership, the fact that you were giving sort of 55% of the land to 30% of the population who owned something like 5.5%, and putting aside the fact that the Palestinians were sort of fundamentally opposed to partition on an ideological basis. I struggle to understand why people don't see the Nakba as an inevitable consequence of the ideology. There was no other way to form this state without the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. There is no way to get a Jewish majority in a place that was not majority Jewish without violence, without the use of force to expel Palestinians from their homes, either by massacring or the brutal tales of Deir Yassin or Tantura, or the marches out of Lid, to the fear of being a victim of the brutal massacres and ethnic cleansing that was happening in other villages. It seems like a natural consequence of the ideology. There was no other way to get to this point except with violence, and no other way to maintain the state that we have today except with violence. And I want to talk a little bit about that, the evolution of the Zionist leadership's thinking around the demographics of that partition.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I think that every Zionist leader and thinker from the late 19th century to 1948 had to ask themselves this very question, which is, how are we going to establish a Jewish state in a land that is 80, 70, 65% non-Jewish, 65, 70, 80% Palestinian Arab? And they came up with different answers to that. I think the standard view was that we would probably have to expel them. That's what Theodore was referred. The Zionists politely refer to this as the transfer idea. But already going back to the 1890s, you have a diary entry in Theodore Herzl's diary, where he says, "Look, we're probably going to have to spirit them across the border to Jordan, because how else are we going to establish a Jewish state in Palestine when there's so many Arabs living there?" And it's not just Theodore Herzl. Really going down the line of every important Zionist thinker and leader, Max Nordau, Israel Zangwill, Joseph Weitz, even Arthur Rupin, who is considered to be,
the head of Brit Shalom and sort of the peacenik, I guess, of the Zionist movement.
Exactly.
Or even Ahad Ha'am. So he was the founder of cultural Zionism, which he started off being less fixated on demographics, but then sort of by the late 20s, early 30s, he jumps on the ethnic cleansing bandwagon, so to speak.
That's exactly right. Arthur Rupin, one of the leaders of the Brit Shalom movement, which you might even say is championed today by anti-Zionist Jews, as being this attempt in the 1920s to try and establish a kind of a Jewish Arab binational state. Even Arthur Rupin basically says, "Look, we're probably going to have to expel them." I mean, it is the mainstream Zionist view that becomes especially, I think, prominent, and the discussions become even, all the more explicit by the 1940s, when it's clear that the British the British Empire is winding down, and that the time and that Jewish terrorism is ramping up, and that there's increased pressure on the British to leave. And especially at this point in time, especially in the 1940s, you have many discussions. Joseph Weitz, who is the head of the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, at the time known as Karen Kayemet L'Israel. So basically, he is openly talking about it. It's not even a secret. They're very explicit about what has to happen to the Arab population in order to establish a Jewish state. And that's why Ilan Pappé, in his book Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, basically says, look, like, this was the inevitable outcome of Zionist ideology. Nur Mosalha has published a book documenting these, the concept of transfer thinking within the Zionist community of Palestine. He has documented with excruciating detail and a tremendous amount of evidence that the basic position of many, if not most, leaders within the community was that the Palestinian Arabs would have to go, and that they probably weren't going to leave on their own, right? There was this fantasy that, hey, maybe we could incentivize them to leave, maybe we could, compel them with through financial incentives, or through maybe other incentives, we could compel them to leave. But I think most Zionists were sober enough to realize that they were not just going to leave on their own, that they would probably have to be forced out.
And then you have, Jabotinsky in the Iron Wall, who I guess is the sort of the precursor to the Likud party today, ideologically speaking, sort of the revisionist Zionist movement, who got a lot of backlash for what I think was actually the most honest or sober description of the reality, which is the only way this could be achieved. The goals of the Zionist project is with the establishment of the Iron Wall, is with destroying any hope the native population had of holding on to Palestine. And despite all the, much ado about nothing, the fanfare, that the incredulousness at the immorality of what he was saying, ultimately the entirety of the movement would say things along the lines of, yes, we can incentivize them, we'll convince them to leave, they'll choose to leave of their own accord. But if they don't, well, then I guess we'll have to resort to quote unquote transfer. And it's there's like an amusing level of cognitive dissonance there for me.
And it wasn't just Zionists, by the way. The Peel Commission, the commission that was produced by the British government in 1937, I believe, proposes that a solution to the Israel-Palestine question is transfer. The British themselves kind of realize that they want to establish a Jewish state, but that's not going to be possible in a land that is majority Palestinian Arab. And so they already in 1937 basically say, look, there's an easy solution to this problem. It's just expelling all the Palestinians. And again, they also try and couch in this language of, hey, maybe it can be voluntary. But again, these are all totally delusional. There's no world in which a group of people numbering millions, more than 1 million, is going to pack up their bags and just leave their homes and abandon their property, abandon their fields of cultivation, abandon their means of livelihood, abandon all their families and their villages that they have such strong ties to. I mean, it's just totally delusional. But that is basically the conclusion that the British arrived to in 1937. And it's kind of the conclusion that the Zionists arrived to already in the years prior to 1948.
Which sort of brings us to kind of the final chapter, in a sense, of the formation of the Palestinian narrative. Is as a consequence of this, pushing the Palestinian population either in internal exile, to the West Bank and Gaza, the modern population of Gaza being majority refugees from the Nakba and the Naksa, and the modern population of the West Bank, and even many parts of East Jerusalem, being refugees from the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948. There is this strengthening of the Palestinian identity, because this intellectual movement that is forming a national character that began to emerge, in the early 1900s, late sort of 1800s, early 1900s, the Istiqlal Party, figures like Al-Issa, all of this is formulating a kind of political identity for the people in the land. But now there is a common struggle. Palestinians have this shared experience of wanting to return home. And by the time you start to get Palestinian literature that we're all very, very familiar with, the likes of Darwish, Ghassan Kanfani, all of it talks about the dispossession from the land. And what that meant for the Palestinian population, what it means to be defined by a village, defined by a place, whether it's the return to Haifa or Ard al-Burtuqal al-Hazin, the land of the sad oranges. What does it mean to be defined by a place that you can never come back to? And what that does to your identity. And that was the seed of the Palestinian liberation movement as we know it. That is what we all now immediately had in common. These regional identities, which were probably the strongest identity for the average Palestinian. If you put aside the elites and the intellectuals, and those heavily involved in politics, the average farmer just wanted to live on his land. A lot of these villages that were ethnically cleansed in the Nakba had peace treaties with the neighboring Jewish agency settlements, and they were amongst the villages that were massacred and destroyed. And obviously Palestinians attempted to return to their homes following 48 to gunfire, basically. They weren't allowed to return home, and that would be the seed of what would later formulate the Palestinian political factions as we know it. And if you want to talk about that a little.
I think you're absolutely right that in Palestine itself, you had many divisions within Arab Palestinian society, right? You had the division between the rural sheikhs and the urban notables. You had the division between the older generation of politicians who dominated Palestinian politics from the early 1920s onwards, and then the younger generation of, let's say, Arab nationalists who were primarily based out of Nablus. Then you had differences, of course, the more traditional differences between the Qais and the Yemeni tribes, as we already talked about. You had many divisions. And then, of course, when you expel all Palestinians to Lebanon and now to Gaza and the West Bank, it creates this incredible sense of unity. And so there's very few things that can unite a people than a shared experience of exile, a shared experience of expulsion. And that's exactly what happens. And you might even say that the strongest you ever felt a Palestinian identity was in the aftermath of the war. Once Palestinians were now outside of Palestine, all the more so you're going to feel that strong longing for Palestine. When you're in Palestine, you probably take it for granted. When you're out of Palestine, now you have a longing for it and a desire to return to it. So I think you're absolutely correct about that, and I think that is part of the reason why these groups form in exile. Fatah being founded in '59 by Yasser Arafat and Abu Iyad, I believe. And then, the PLO established in 1964 with the support of the Arab League. And so this does create, I think, conditions for Palestinian rejuvenation and Palestinian liberation. It's, of course, in exile where you get all these Palestinian groups rather than in Israel proper, in Palestine, right, where you have still many hundreds of thousands, 150,000 Palestinians remain within the borders of the newly established state of Israel. And of course, they're subject to a military occupation. There are checkpoints around their villages and their towns.
Everybody forgets that they didn't get citizenship, right away, and that was decades later. That they were under direct military rule. There's sort of just this Bantustanization process where effectively the people who lived inside of 48, they were the ones who lived under occupation. They were the ones who lived under direct military rule. And then you had sort of the old Palestine protectorate, in Gaza, puppeted by Egypt, and then Jordan controlling the West Bank, both of which had their own issues, but were sort of far less significant than what was happening to the Palestinian population on the military occupation. I mean, indeed, Israel had to have a civil rights movement just to give equal rights to Mizrahi Jews, not just the Palestinian population. But then there is this shift of the movement. By the time you get to 67, now that population gets citizenship, and it is the population in the Bantustans of the West Bank and Gaza that fall under military occupation.
Yeah, I think if you want to trace the evolution and development and progress of Palestinian national activity, you can basically just trace the evolution of Israeli violence against Palestinians, right? First, it's committed against all these Palestinians who wind up in exile. Now they're dispersed and displaced. and they're the ones who established the you might say the first real Palestinian nationalist organizations in exile. Fatah, the PLO, the PFLP, the DFLP. These are all exile groups. And then after 67. The real resistance to Israeli rule, increasingly from the 1980s onwards, is now based in the occupied territories. Right? It's Islamic Jihad, it's Hamas. And if we want to take the story all the way up to the present day, you can add Lion's Den as well as the Jenin brigades to that list. But you're exactly right that wherever you have the most gruesome Israeli violence, that's where you have the most, I would say, most steadfastness on the Palestinian side, and the most resistance on the Palestinian side. And even if you look at really within the Palestinian occupied territories, it's Gaza where Israeli forces have committed the most violence. And it's Gaza where you have the most fierce Palestinian resistance, right? That you might say that is true already from the first Intifada, even before that, going back to the 1950s, right? It's in Gaza where the Israeli army enters in 1956, slaughters hundreds of Palestinians in Khan Yunis in November 1956, slaughters probably more than 100 Palestinians in Rafah in 1956, and then it's in Gaza where where Israeli occupation is the most brutal, it's the most gruesome, it's the most violent. Lo and behold, Gaza is where you have the fiercest resistance. Gaza is where you get Hamas and Islamic Jihad in the 1980s. And then the West Bank, you might say, is actually quite similar, where, in the West Bank, where's the fiercest resistance to Israeli rule? It's in Jenin and Nablus, right? Where you have the most, go back, where was the most violent Israeli incursions in the West Bank? It was in Jenin in 2002, where Israel bulldozes 3,000 Palestinian homes, right? It's in Nablus, where they impose the most intense closures. So I think, resistance is very much a function of Israeli violence. Where you have the most intense Israeli violence, you tend to see the most violent forms of Palestinian resistance.
I mean,
I'm curious what you think about that, by the way. That's kind of my own kind of developing hypothesis.
I think you're pretty damn right. I think that is fairly accurate. I mean, there's this media narrative that I've heard in this latest escalation of the war on Palestine, and it's this whole like denazification or de-radicalization idea. They're taught to hate. Palestinians are raised in an education system that makes them hate Israel. Like I left Palestine when I was a teenager, but I went to school there for effectively I lived half my life there, and I was never taught most of my deeply held beliefs. It was all a function of my own experiences. We are taught, by the night raids, the military incursions, the fact that you are entirely at the mercy of the mood of a teenage soldier. We lived it. We saw it with our own eyes. I mean, there's this constant talk of human shields, but I remember when my neighbors, like teenagers, were held as literal human shields. They were held in front of Israeli soldiers as they went door to door in Nablus, and the second Intifada, that happened after the second Intifada, and that is what breeds Palestinian resistance. That is why the onslaught, the genocidal onslaught on Gaza today will have nothing but the opposite effect. I mean, all you are doing is breeding another generation that is deeply, almost irreconcilably committed to fighting back. And it's an age-old idea. It's like, I don't know why Palestinians are going to be the only people in history who, in response to oppression, choose indifference. There's like sex semper tyrannis. It is the most natural human reaction to oppression.
Yeah, I think many, if not most, of the accusations leveled against the Palestinians are actually admissions of the Israeli government themselves. I think starting with this idea, as you correctly pointed out, that there's a culture of hate. That is something you'll probably have heard dozens, if not hundreds of times from Israel's apologists and its supporters. In fact, if you look into the Israeli curriculum and look at the maps used in Israeli schools, and look at what is taught about Israeli history, and you will come to the conclusion that there were no Palestinians in Palestine. It was an empty. It was a land for a people without a land. The maps of Israel show Israeli towns and Israeli cities, and Israeli population centers. They don't even. There literally are no Palestinians. They're completely erased from the Israeli curriculum. They don't exist.
We're just Arabs.
If they're anything, they're Arabs. But basically they don't exist. I mean, that's certainly the case in the Jewish curriculum that I was raised with. And it's all the more so the case in Israeli schools. And then you see these, I mean, you saw the video with these Israeli little kids basically calling for a complete destruction of every last man, woman, child, every last soul in Gaza. They're literally calling for genocide. These are 10-year-old Israeli kids singing, Hanukkah tunes and producing like highly produced like music videos of these Israeli kids calling for a genocide of the Palestinian people. It's incredibly disturbing.
And putting aside the media context, just the cabinet, like you have the highest ranking military officials, the prime minister, asking an advisor to put together a plan to thin the population of Gaza to a minimum, to the genocidal rhetoric that has come from every part of this cabinet and its war ministers. And look, we'll have much longer conversations diving into that in detail in the future, but it is a natural extent of the same ideology. For you to have this state here, it is fundamentally anti-Palestinian. There is no way to have a Jewish majority state in a land that even to this very day, from the river to the sea, is not Jewish majority. It's something like 51% Palestinian, 49% Jewish, or something along those lines, before you factor in the Palestinian diaspora, the Palestinian refugees in exile. And to this very day, the same state which was built by ethnic cleansing and built with violence must be maintained with violence. That state never had the consent, the democratic will of the local population for it. And the only way to keep a population under your boot is with violent repression. That is why there is a military occupation in the first place, whether it was direct prior to the First Intifada or subcontracted out to the PA with the enclaves that we have in the West Bank, or the blockade of Gaza, to what we are seeing today.
Yeah, I think anyone who before October 7th talked about Palestinian culture of hate, and they raised their kids to hate us, should be absolutely horrified by the statements coming out of every single Israeli political and military leader since October 7th. We're talking about the prime minister himself, Bibi Netanyahu, likening the Palestinians in Gaza to Amalek, the biblical peoples who God commanded the Israelites to kill every man, woman, child, and ox. You have to kill the livestock even, because you can't have a single living soul remaining of these people. And that's the prime minister. This is the person in charge of the situation in Gaza, calling for the complete erasure of every last living soul in Gaza. And if you ever hear someone talk about a Palestinian culture of hate who doesn't also talk about these genocidal calls, they're just being incredibly duplicitous and dishonest. And then, I mean, I think what you said about this, we saw recent statements coming out of the United States Secretary of State Blinken, talking about the Palestinian use of human shields, which is so cynical because, as you correctly pointed out, this is a tried and true Israeli military practice. There are dozens of videos of Israeli soldiers grabbing Palestinian kids and using the Palestinians as human shields in a very direct sense, in a very literal sense.
Metaphorical one. No.
We're not talking about metaphors of operating in crowded urban areas because you've been confined to a prison, an open air prison. That we're not talking about that. We're talking about literally using Palestinian kids as human shields. And that happens in every engagement, almost every single Israeli military engagement in the West Bank and in Gaza. You have videos surfacing. And these are just the documented cases. God only knows how many more undocumented cases there are. In the Goldstone report of 2008, 2009, there was no evidence found that Palestinians used any human shields at all. The opposite, of course, was true. In fact, the Israeli military was seen. There was proof that the Israeli military was using Palestinians in Gaza as human shields as they would move in and out of urban areas, using Palestinians to protect themselves, hoping that the Hamas militants would not shoot at them because they were using Palestinians to defend themselves. So it's incredibly cynical for for Secretary of State Anthony Blinken to say that, in complete contradiction to much evidence that suggests that actually Israelis probably embrace this policy much more so than Palestinians. And here we are in a world where, the United States is, basically completely dehumanizing the Palestinians, discrediting Palestinian death counts, when the reality is, again, the exact opposite, right? It's the Palestinians are almost certainly underestimating the death tolls, with thousands of Palestinians under the rubble, and unreachable because of the Israeli blockade and because of the Israeli aerial bombardment, while at the same time it's the Israelis who are lowering their death figures. First it was 1,400, then it was 1,200, then I think I saw another report that it was 1,000. And then of course always citing that headline figure of 1,400 or 1,200 or 1,000, rather than of course the number of civilians, which is lower. So again, I think the duplicitousness and the double standard that is applied is disgusting. It's horrifying, and it's dehumanizing the Palestinians and ultimately making it easier for Israel to carry out its genocidal war on the Palestinian people of Gaza.
Very well put. I want to close on this idea of peace. What are people fighting for from the river to the sea? These are all narrative points I hear constantly. The attempts at equivocating Palestinian calls for freedom from the river to the sea to a call for genocide, when it is exactly the opposite. Or the I guess my frustration with the language of peace. It's like everybody wants peace. Ben Gvir wants peace. Smotrich wants peace. Netanyahu wants peace. Everybody just wants peace on their terms. It is meaningless to use that word in the context of Israel Palestine, because the group that is in power, the group that is oppressing another group that is happy with the status quo, like, of course they want peace and quiet. Of course Israelis want to live in peace. They want to continue to have what they have today. They want the status quo to be maintained, and they want to go on with their lives. And of course Palestinians want to break that status quo, because we are the ones who are under the boot of oppression. I mean, a much more relevant term is justice, or liberation, or freedom, or if you want to put it in like American liberal terms, equality. The PLO and the PFLP, the DFLP, Fatah, and pretty much every Palestinian faction, right up until the Oslo, what would turn into the Oslo process, following the First Intifada, we had a fairly clear liberation ideology. We spoke about a democratic state where Muslims, Christians, Jews, Druze, a non-sectarian state from the river to the sea, and the right of return of Palestinian refugees. Layla Khaled gives a fairly famous interview where she speaks about, what do you want the Jewish population to do? And she just said they can either live side by side with us equally, or they can leave. But like, fundamentally, the fact that one group of people rejects the idea of equality, rejects the idea of being part of the same political system, and needs and has this need for a state that privileges them over the rest of the population of the land, and that idea is somehow acceptable under the guise of security. Like, I can't think of an apartheid system or a racial or discriminatory government that didn't claim that security was the necessary reason why they had to continue to oppress another population. It's why I see kind of like no moral equivalence between the two sides, because what am I fighting for as a Palestinian? There is nothing about the Palestinian ideology that calls for the ethnic cleansing or the demographic control of one group of people over another. Certainly not in our sort of like foundational liberation movements. It was simply a rejection of partition and a rejection of Zionism, and a rejection of the disenfranchisement of the native population of Palestine from any right to self-determination, any right to live on their land. And it's not so much about just having a state for the sake of having a state. You know, Blinken and the United States and the international community love to talk in these empty platitudes about why there must be a Palestinian state, and putting aside the fact that there is no meaningful pressure to ever do anything about it. That is not what the Palestinian cause is about. It isn't just about being able to say on paper that, oh, we've been admitted to the UN and now we have some degree of representation somewhere. It is the fact that the majority of the populations of the West Bank and Gaza aren't from Gaza and they want to return home. It is the fact that so long as you have a ideology that practices this ethno-religious supremacy inside of the land, where there are many other groups of people, there will always be this system of domination. Like, it is intrinsic to, it is an inevitable consequence of the Zionist project, and it is playing out right before our eyes. You know, there is no way to. Israel wants the maximum amount of land with the minimum number of Palestinians, and the only way to achieve that is to forcibly remove that population, either by driving them out, by making conditions unbearable, by creating facts on the ground, and then doing diplomacy later. And that seems very much to be the strategy. You know, make conditions unbearable so that the population leaves and Israel can sort of avoid the blame for it, and then apologize for it afterwards once it's become the new reality. And throughout this sort of chronology that we've painted, I see the very same ideology. You have this burgeoning movement that wove together many fairly factionalized and separate tribal groups, regional groups of the land, into this Palestinian identity that was, forged into one of the, frankly, strongest nationalisms that I know of, because it's really more than nationalism. It's a cause. Being Palestinian is both an identity, but it is also just literally a struggle, as a result of what we have lived through. And to this very day, what we are fighting for is liberation, and what Israel is fighting for is to maintain a system of domination. And that's why, look, liberation movement, immoral things occur people do immoral things in the face of a good cause. You can legislate the small details of the history of this war, but I see like no moral equivalence between what the two sides are fighting for, and I also see no future unless that narrative is understood.
I think you're absolutely correct. I think that it's incredibly sad to see this phrase, Free Palestine, from the river to the sea, being misinterpreted. I think that from the river to the sea, to Palestinians and to human rights activists, means that Palestinians face different types of oppression and different types of discrimination and different types of domination, whether they're in Gaza, whether they're in Israel proper, whether they're in East Jerusalem, whether they're in the West Bank, and then within the West Bank, whether they're in areas B, areas A, or area C, or in the seam zone. So you have, or whether you're a Palestinian in exile. So, I think that ultimately is why that phrase is so powerful and resonates with so many Palestinians, because what it's saying is that despite attempts to divide us, despite attempts to create divisions within a Palestinian society, despite giving us citizenship, a second-class citizenship in the state of Israel, we have a national movement and a national struggle that transcends those divisions. And so within Israel proper, you have 1.2 million Palestinians who have been facing a discrimination for decades. 80 to 90% of the land of the state of Israel is off limits to Palestinians. They're denied of the rights to buy or technically lease for 100 years. that 80 to 90% of that land, which is in the control of these admissions committees that basically reject Palestinians outright. You have hundreds of Palestinians, citizens of Israel, arrested over the past 2 months for liking a Facebook post or an Instagram post that shows solidarity with Gaza. Okay? That's the level of state repression that those Palestinians are facing. They are systematically discriminated against in the workplace. Many more hundreds have been fired from their jobs in the past few months, again, for innocuous posts in solidarity with the people facing genocide. That's the Palestinians within Israel. Okay. And then you have Palestinians in East Jerusalem, 15,000 of whom have been stripped of their residency status owing to discriminatory laws, who are not automatically granted Israeli citizens, even though they live in land annexed by the state of Israel. Then you have Palestinians in the West Bank who have been occupied for 56 years, who live in a state of apartheid in which they live side by side Jews who are subject to Israeli civilian courts and Israeli civilian law. And the Palestinians are subject to Israeli military law and Israeli military courts, which have a rate of prosecution of 99.7%. I mean, what? So you have apartheid in the West Bank, and then in Gaza you have total siege and total blockade, in which 80% of households are dependent on food aid from international humanitarian organizations, in which the youth unemployment rate hovers between 60 and 75%. In which 90% of the water, this is all before October 7th, obviously, in which 90% of the water is undrinkable. In which there's no ability to leave the open air prison. You are locked in a 21 by 7 kilometer cage. And when you have no life, no future, no prospects. So it doesn't matter whether you're a Palestinian in Israel proper, in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, or in Gaza. You are facing a different type of discrimination depending on where you live and what your legal status is. But the point is that's why that phrase is so resonant and so powerful to all Palestinians, and why it's such a liberatory phrase, and means and has such a powerful meaning to so many Palestinians, because it unites Palestinians. Because Palestinians live in all areas between the river and the sea, but face different types of discrimination between the river and the sea, and that's ultimately why I think that phrase is so powerful, and why we should embrace it, and why people who are likening that phrase to a call for genocide is disgusting, and really, I mean, it is really, at the same time that you have Israeli leaders literally calling for genocide, it's the Palestinians calling for liberation that's being interpreted as genocide. I think that kind of sums up the situation in the West and in the United States, and kind of just how disconnected our government is in the US and in Europe, and many European governments as well, how disconnected they are from the reality in the ground, which is one in which Palestinians are facing discrimination and occupation and apartheid and siege. And Israelis are pushing on maintaining that system of domination, that system of apartheid, and that system of siege and blockade, and trying to expand it and extend it and entrench it. And that's the reality on the ground. And that's why we have to continue to fight for the liberation of all Palestinian people between the river and the sea.
It says more about, you, the person who interprets my call and my fight for the same rights, freedom, and liberation that you would fight for, that you see that as an existential threat. That is sort of the point. And calls to dismantle apartheid South Africa were not a call for genocide. Calls to dismantle any system of domination is not a call for genocide. It is liberation, frankly, for all the people in the land, both the oppressor and the oppressed. It is breaking down the ideology at its core. And it misses I think, whether it's the two-state paradigm or this, dispute over borders narrative that I constantly hear, it misses the entire point of the Palestinian identity, of how it formed, of how our regional, tribal identities coalesced into this broader unity that we have today, of this common struggle. And it misses the point of why Zionism created this problem in the first place, and why it continues to exist today. The state was created with violence against the will of the population that lived in the land, and it is maintained that way. And it is only by dismantling that system and dismantling that ideology that there can ever be a way forwards for all the people of the land. I can think of nothing more idealistic. I'm frankly surprised at how much idealism is there in that idea. How much possibility of hope and reconciliation and a better future is posed there. And I wonder why that is so lost on both Western audiences and Israeli propaganda.
I wonder if that's a nice place to wrap things up. I really enjoyed this conversation, Zahir, and really appreciate your hosting this conversation. And I just want to just give you a shout out. And yeah, thanks again for hosting. Really enjoyed the chat.
Very much appreciated having you, Zachary Foster, and highly recommend both your PhD dissertation and some of the your other academic works to anyone who's interested in the history of Palestine. And I think we'll close on that note.
Thanks again.